Hello, everyone. This is Haley Hansen. I'm the leader of Husch Blackwell's Higher Education Group. We are excited to present our webinar today on web accessibility issues, best practices, strategies, and tactics for assessing your institution's strengths and vulnerabilities in this developing area. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see multiple application icons for your use during the program today. I'd like to take a minute and just highlight a few of these icons. If you have questions, and we encourage questions during the webinar, please submit your question via the question box. We'll try to answer these questions during the webinar today, but as many of you know who have been on other webinars, sometimes time runs out, and we will provide you a fuller answer via email a couple days after the webinar if we aren't able to get to your question. We truly appreciate your audience participation and encourage you to submit your questions. There's also an icon to assist you with your viewing preferences. Accordingly, note that you can expand your slide area by clicking the maximize icon on the top right of the slide, or you can just drag the bottom right corner of the slide area to make it larger. If you have any technical difficulties, please click the help icon. It has a question mark, which may be confusing for some that thinks that's the question box, but it's not. It is the technical difficulties, and a lot of our most common technical issues are under that list as well. A copy of today's slide deck is available for you in the resource icon, and that's another folder at the bottom of your screen. This program has been approved for continuing legal education credit in Colorado, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Tennessee, Texas, and Wisconsin. To report your hours in Illinois, Kansas, Nebraska, Tennessee, or Texas, click on the CLE icon at the bottom of your screen and make sure you complete the questions. A recording of this webinar will be available to you tomorrow to watch and share within your institution. Once available, a link of the recording will be emailed to you with a certificate of attendance. Joining me today are Julie Maselli and Elizabeth Samples. Julie is a partner and member of our higher education team, and she dedicates her practice to serving private and public institutions. She has concentrated experience advising colleges and universities on a variety of issues, including web accessibility, campus safety, financial aid, and other areas for policy development. Elizabeth is also a member of our higher education team and provides a unique experience from her background as serving as a former OCR investigator. She also advises public and private clients in many areas, including web accessibility, the Clery Act, Americans with Disabilities Act, Title IX, and Title IV. So thank you to Julie and to Elizabeth, and we will get started on our presentation today. So as we talk about web accessibility, we are going to make sure that we cover a variety of issues. First, the legal and regulatory landscape. What does that look like? We're also going to talk about accessibility barriers. I'm going to give you an update on WCAG 2.0 overview and compliance points. What can you take away from this presentation to help your institution? Notably, if you need access to a transcript today, it will be available. Please feel free to submit an email or a question, and we will make sure we have a transcript so that our webinar is accessible as well. So let's start with a poll question. So this is the first poll question of today. Has your institution developed a website accessibility policy or otherwise identified web content guidelines that it will use when testing your own website? And the answers are yes, no, or I don't know. And Elizabeth, what are you finding with the clients that you're working with on web accessibility issues in this particular question?
Sure. Yeah, we've seen, some of our clients have had sort of a few years standing accessibility committee or group that has been working on some of these issues, including developments of a web accessibility policy. Others are starting to develop them more recently as there's been an uptick in enforcement.
Yeah. Well, and we've got a few people that have submitted, still a little bit lower number, but we will show you the responses here. So the majority is saying yes, that you've developed at least a policy or identified web content guidelines to make sure that you're testing your website. A few of you are saying no, and some saying I don't know. So obviously, hopefully one of the things that you can do today is if you're in the I don't know category or even no, take some points from today's webinar to think about how you want to address this at your campus. It's an issue that's going to affect all of our campuses, and we need to make sure that we're ahead of the curve and not responding to the issue after an OCR complaint has been filed. So let's really talk about this landscape. What is the legal landscape that we're working within when we talk about web accessibility? First of all, talking about Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. This was the first statute regarding disability accommodations. And when we talk about Section 504 and the ADA have now mirror provisions, so we'll talk about those, but this applies to private institutions. And typically when we're talking about 504, we're talking about accommodations for students within our private colleges and universities. But also it's important to really understand the guiding principles and how OCR will enforce Section 504. And I really want to point your attention to the language that talks about no otherwise qualified individual with a disability. That's very important language, and language that not only the courts but also OCR have really looked at when determining whether the institution has handled a particular request for accommodation or a particular issue regarding a disability appropriately. And so that's one of the key pieces of language we want you to be aware of. And obviously Section 504 applies to private institutions because those private institutions take federal financial assistance. And so that's where the tie comes in to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. As I said, the ADA mirrors this language, and specifically Title II of the ADA applies to public institutions of higher education and public entities as well, and has that same no qualified individual language shall be, again, excluded from participation in or denied benefits or services or programs because of such a disability. But Title II also adds the last language that's on this slide that has this communications requirement. And it's important to understand that as public institutions. Most of you have a very good grasp on this and are effectively communicating, but making sure not only it's a requirement for public institutions, but also for private institutions that we're clearly communicating, have our disability services coordinator or office located on our website that's accessible to students, that we have information regarding our policies, and that we have interactive processes as we're going through disability accommodations. So again, just kind of bedrock principles as we talk about disabilities. The third area that we wanted to focus on is Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and this really focuses on places of public accommodation. And it's been clear that under Title III, colleges and universities are places of public accommodation, along with a lot of other areas that are places of public accommodation that we use in our daily lives. And it's important to understand as you look at Title III that, again, no one can be discriminated against based on their disability, and that they must have full and equal enjoyment of all goods and services that the colleges and universities offer. And I think that's an important piece of information to remember as well. And then finally, there's been a lot of discussion about, especially with web accessibility, Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. We use Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act as really the model principle for looking at what institutions need to do regarding web accessibility. It is not applicable, though. It only applies to the federal government, including governmental agencies. And it's important to understand that under Section 508, the Access Board published their final rule providing standards that go into effect on January 1st of 2018, specifically for areas including computer hardware and software, websites particularly, phone systems, and copiers. And Julie's going to talk a lot more about how this is applicable to colleges and universities, but I think it's important to understand really that legal landscape. So a lot of questions are asked as well about particular state laws, and we've seen some activity in a number of different states regarding making sure that information technology is accessible. And one of the big areas that we have seen this push is in Illinois. And if you are a college and University of Illinois, you need to be aware that the Illinois Information Technology Accessibility Act was passed and is law, and talks about a lot of requirements and for Illinois agencies and specifically universities as well to ensure that their websites, their information systems, their information technology is all accessible to individuals with disabilities, and making sure that those agencies, those universities are following the ADA and Section 504 to establish those specific standards. And in Illinois, they have, again, encouraged institutions to be proactive in making sure that their websites are accessible. Another state that we'll just point out, and we have a lot of states that are represented on the call today, so we can't go through all of them, but Oklahoma is another state that has legislation specifically regarding accessibility and web accessibility and has been in place for quite some time. So if you're in those particular states, you want to make sure you're aware of what your requirements are, and again, if those state laws apply to you as well, or apply to your institution. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie to talk about applicability to the web.
Thanks, Haley. So many of you may have a state law that applies, but I really want to talk more about the federal laws because they apply more universally to institutions of higher education, and we should talk about the applicability of Section 504 and the ADA to websites specifically. So the Rehab Act was passed in 1973, well before the Internet. So there really isn't anything contemplated within the law about website accessibility. While the ADA came later in 1990, the Internet was still in its infancy at that time, so there's still no mention of the World Wide Web or web accessibility in that law either. So this has led to a lot of confusion around whether the ADA and Section 504 actually require accessibility of websites and electronic information. And if so, then what would compliance look like since the law doesn't talk about it? But web accessibility it's not a brand new concept. As Haley talked about earlier, the federal government had been experimenting with web accessibility standards due to the Section 508 amendment to the Rehab Act, which took place in 1998, just 8 years after the ADA. And a lot of that drove the development of web accessibility techniques and standards as the federal government was working to bring itself into compliance and define what compliance looked like. So following suit, the Department of Justice had started signaling for several years that it did interpret the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 to apply to websites. It actually formally began rulemaking on this issue back in 2010 when it first released a notice of proposed rulemaking for web accessibility standards under the ADA. Those regulations kicked around for over 6 years, and generally there was continued work at the Department of Justice around those regulations, but given the complication and the variability in websites, it took them 6 years until 2016 when they announced through a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking that specific regulations would not be forthcoming until 2018. So they were indicating to the field that ADA regulations were still yet another 2 years away. And so this was a very long process that the DOJ started in 2010. But most recently, the Trump administration has decided to place those pending rules on inactive status. So it seems unlikely that we're going to get clear regulations and guidance under the ADA as to what website accessibility would look like, at least during this administration, but it's possible they could be resurrected later, and we're simply going to have to wait and see. But what we do have is a longstanding interpretation, at least for now, that the Department of Justice does feel that ADA and Section 504 does apply to websites. The courts are also considering this issue. So while we're going to have to wait for some clarity on regulations, we're seeing an increase in litigation in this space that courts are trying to evaluate and make decisions on in the absence of regulations. And that litigation includes higher education institutions, but also a number of places of public accommodation like restaurant retailers and financial institutions. So we look to the litigation that is evaluating two questions. One, whether the ADA and Section 504 apply to websites, and if so, then what compliance looks like, and we're looking to that litigation for answers to those questions. One thing that I'll note is that there is a split in the circuits, and we're getting varied decisions out of district courts in how they apply this. There's a smattering of cases that I've listed here involving some retailers, and these are very recent cases that we're looking to as models for institutions of higher ed as to how the courts may consider these cases. Just to give you a sample, we had a case in California very recently where a judge dismissed a blind man's suit against Domino's Pizza, and that was for an inaccessible website that allowed individuals to order a pizza online. And the basis for the court's decision in dismissing the case was that Domino's was providing an option for individuals to call a toll-free number 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to order a pizza or for whenever they were open, so that in light of the fact that the Department of Justice had not issued clear regulations on the standard for what would be a website, accessible website, the court here felt that that alternative was accessible, quote unquote, enough. But the court did have to get there. And so we see this one case out of California, but then on the other hand, we had another recent case where a Florida judge ruled that the grocery store Winn-Dixie has to offer the same accommodations on its websites for those who have a disability as it does in its stores, meaning its website had to be as accessible as it was providing in stores. Another case that we just saw out of New York ruled that the website for Blick art materials had to be accessible to an individual with a visual impairment. There are numerous other cases with varied decisions, and I just read that there's a California woman who sued Kmart, Empire Today, and Ace Hardware, and all those companies have been accused of having websites and mobile apps that are not accessible to individuals with visual impairments, and that therefore they can't access the services in an equal and fair way. So we're watching these cases, but the general trend that we are seeing is that most courts, federal courts, are recognizing that the ADA and Section 504 does apply to websites, but with the lack of regulatory guidance from the Department of Justice, there is a varied approach as to what actually is accessible. For instance, the Domino's Pizza case ruled that, well, with the absence of those rules, the phone line was sufficient. But then there are other courts that are coming out and saying you actually have to have much more specific accessibility standards met on your website to be compliant. Elizabeth and I are going to talk about those standards shortly, but I want to continue on this framework that we're talking about, the legal framework. In addition to these retailer cases and cases against financial institutions like banks and lenders, we are seeing a significant increase in complaints and suits in higher education. I think most of you are well aware that we continue to see OCR opening and hopefully resolving investigations against institutions of higher education for website accessibility complaints. And we've seen a number of repeat plaintiffs filing these stock complaints against institutions. In fact, we have even seen places where the plaintiff may forget to copy and paste the wrong defendant's name, and so the wrong institution is actually being listed in the complaint. But these complaints are being recycled and sent around against institutions. We've also seen some recent and very high-profile cases, more specifically against, for instance, Harvard and MIT. These were filed around in 2015, And it's not just by individuals, it's not just individuals with visual impairments who are seeking relief, but also advocates for the deaf community, and those were the plaintiffs in these cases. They filed suit against Harvard and MIT for failing to capture online lectures, courses, and other materials in an audio format. And since January 2015, we are seeing a lot of coverage in the media on these kinds of cases. The New York Times, for instance, has covered this issue a couple of times. Recently, they estimated that over 750 lawsuits have been filed against academic institutions just since January 2015. Many of these suits, in our opinion, are very similar in nature. They assert that individuals with disabilities are not able to access or locate critical information on very specific websites, generally around tuition, academic calendar, and admissions. With the absence of clear regulations as to what is compliance, we continue to expect that the onslaught of litigation in this area will increase. So on that, I'm curious whether your institution has received an external or internal complaint regarding website accessibility. This is our next poll question. And of course, your answers are anonymous. I'm going to give you a moment to go ahead and respond. We're looking to see if you, yes, have received an internal complaint. Option 2 is yes, we have received an internal or an external complaint through a demand letter or an agency enforcement. The third option is no, we have not received any complaint regarding web accessibility. And the last option is I don't know. And I'll just give that another minute for some responses to come in. Let's see what we've got. So a number of you have received an internal complaint from somebody within your organization, but more of you, unfortunately, are seeing external complaints in a more formal way through either a demand letter or agency enforcement. About a third of you have not yet received complaints regarding web accessibility, and that's a good thing, but there's almost 40% of you who aren't aware. We are seeing increases in all kinds of complaints, from informal complaints that may be submitted by a student or an employee, to the more formal complaints of litigation or OCR. We just simply have seen an increase in that enforcement activity and in litigation, and we expect that to continue. So with that, Elizabeth is going to talk about other areas of electronic accessibility that institutions should be thinking of beyond websites. And then we're going to go back and forth and provide you with some key compliance points and tips.
Thank you, Julie. So as Julie mentioned, we are seeing an increase in enforcement activity specifically related to website accessibility, but also more broadly related to academic technology, otherwise referred to as electronic information technology. So as Haley originally kicked off with the sort of legal landscape, we know that Section 504 and Titles 2 and 3 of the ADA are broad non-discrimination statutes. And so while the applicability to the web is something that we're still sorting out, there is also applicability to this academic technology. So institutions need to remember that these non-discrimination provisions do apply as the institutions are developing programs and activities and taking advantage of additional technology. So they can't overlook these non-discrimination provisions. We're not going to discuss EIT, electronic information technology, much beyond these slides, but do want to highlight it since it is an area of importance for your institutions. With respect to academic technology specifically, really internal controls and issues, addressing this issue at the procurement stage is really imperative. So you can establish procurement policies or really carefully review your contracts at the time of procurement, since that's really the best time to really address potential accessibility issues with the technology that you're adopting. So if we go back, really this began with a Dear Colleague letter that OCR published related to what we call the Kindle DX case. So at that time, a number of institutions had implemented the use of e-book readers or Kindle readers as a replacement for traditional textbooks. Obviously, this can have significant advantages for the institutions and for its students, but there were unfortunately some accessibility issues. The Kindle DX didn't have full text-to-speech technology. So while the content was accessible, the menu and navigational controls were not. And so students who were visually impaired had trouble or could simply not identify at all the book they had selected or navigate throughout the content. So the institutions entered into a voluntary resolution agreement and agreed not to purchase any e-readers unless the devices were fully accessible. And there, that last sentence really kind of captures OCR's enforcement position with respect to this matter, that it was unacceptable for universities to use emerging technology, which we can all agree is a good thing, without instituting or insisting rather that the technology was accessible to all students. Here is a quick slide on a definition of EIT, and it's intentionally dense because we wanted to demonstrate that when considering potential enforcement in this area, it can go far beyond just access to your website. So this definition comes from an OCR agreement where the complaint related to more broadly access to EIT. And so there you can see that it did include internet and intranet websites, but also went well beyond that. Electronic books, learning management systems, classroom technology and multimedia, telephones, ATM machines, information kiosks. So really, depending on, if you're, responding to an OCR complaint investigation or just trying to take stock of your technology, including your website, it's really important to keep in mind that EIT can go much beyond your website. So now we're going to take a minute to talk about the guidelines that are available to help assess accessibility and figure out any remediation that may need to be taken on your website. So WCAG 2.0 stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and these provide guidelines for institutions to assess the accessibility. They are developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, also known as W3C, and this is an organization that's really comprised of member organizations, staff, and the public, all who work together to create these web standards. The mission is to lead the web to its full potential and create a web for all. So despite the absence of specific standards applicable to educational institutions, as Haley and Julie both discussed, WCAG 2.0 is generally the accepted guideline for website accessibility. The guidelines are divided into 4 main principles, and we're going to talk through some of the specifics of these and some specific examples of how this may operate on your website. But those 4 principles are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So just to quickly break those down, so perceivable means that a person can access the information through their senses. So for example, if someone can't see color, color images, other color on your page, what might they be missing? What information might you be communicating through color that they can't perceive? Operable, the navigation of your website must be operable. And this is really an important compliance point that we'll talk about in a little more detail, but we need to provide ways for users to navigate through the website, to find content, to determine where they are on the website. And really this is about the structure of your website and your web pages. Understandable information and the operation of the interface must be understandable. So this is about both the language that's used on the website and also the predictable operation of the pages. And finally, robust has a set of guidelines that helps to ensure that these principles will remain applicable as new technologies develop. And the WCAG 2.0 has various success criteria at 3 different levels, A, AA, and AAA. And there is a working draft underway for WCAG 2.1. It was published most recently in September, and another draft is forthcoming. So the WCAG 2.1 will incorporate much of the 2.0 guidelines and also include some new success criteria. Some examples include for zooming content and graphics contrast. Finally, just to mention Accessible Rich Internet Applications, or ARIA. This is another set of guidelines that helps to ensure that web applications are accessible as they become more dynamic. So as you know, when you are interacting with a website, really web content is becoming less and less static, and users can really affect the content that they're viewing as they progress through a page. And so ARIA really helps to provide guidelines to address the development, the ongoing development of the Internet. So now that we've sort of done an overview of the guidelines, want to talk about just generally some barriers that individuals may experience on your website. So if you think first and foremost, of the incredible importance of your institution's websites, you're providing a broad range of information through your to your constituents. You're allowing individuals to carry out significant functions on your website. And these functions and this information is conveyed to all sorts of individuals in your community, your students, your faculty, your staff, parents, alumni, donors, prospective students, and the public. So we're really reaching a broad audience through our website, and individuals may approach our website with various impairments. And so here's kind of a broad list of the impairments that individuals may have that affect how they are able to access the information on your website. So individuals with visual impairments, again, may not be able to access your website if it doesn't meet some of the WCAG standards. Of course, individuals with hearing impairments may have issues as well. And then mobility impairments affect individuals who may not be able to use a mouse or have limited fine motor control and are accessing your website through a keyboard, for example. We have just a short clip here. We're going to get into some of the technical issues that you need to be aware of when assessing your website. And we have a video that was produced by the University of Washington in Seattle. They have a long-standing accessibility initiative, and this video was published recently on October 3rd, and it's available on YouTube, and we'll provide the link as well if you'd like to view it in full. There are two speakers that are on this video, IT Accessibility Team Member Hadi Rangan and the Director of Accessible Technology Services, Cheryl Bergstaller. And so this first video is going to highlight issues that individuals may face when alternate text is not provided appropriately.
That screen reader can only access the text that's presented on the screen. And so if someone just scans in a document and puts an image up on their website, that screen reader is not going to be able to read that content. And so the web developer, in that case, needs to know to create all their materials so that they're accessible to a screen reader. In other words, so that they can access the text for that screen reader to read it aloud to a person.
Okay, so here on this slide, sort of following up to that video, we want to talk about clear visuals. And this relates both to images, but also to other non-text content. So an example there would be a form wouldn't necessarily identify a checkbox to an individual if it didn't have proper coding underneath it, or your search function on your website. A magnifying glass might not appropriately communicate to individuals the function of that particular field. So for non-text content, we have to provide text alternatives so that individuals can understand the images. When thinking about photographs, there is guidance to really highlight what this means. It's not just about tagging a photo as a photo, but really paying close attention to what it is that the photo is communicating, so that we can ensure that it is equally conveying that message to an individual who may have a visual impairment. So an example here with this photograph, we have some of our study abroad students, let's say, enjoying the fullness of their study abroad experience by taking a tour through the jungle, riding on elephants. An alt tag here just sort of identifying elephants, parading through the jungle won't necessarily convey what it is that we're trying to convey through this message, which is the benefits of our study abroad program. So we want to make sure that we're not just using phrases like image of or graphic of, but really trying to convey the information that is communicated through the image. Clear visuals also relates to issues of color for individuals who have color blindness or low vision or other visual impairments. Color should not be used as a navigation tool, and also contrast issues come up here under clear visuals. And the WCAG guidelines provide specific technical requirements for how contrast that we must provide so that individuals can view it. And here I think the principle of universal design really applies well to issues of contrast, because while you may get some counter arguments about what looks pretty or what our school colors are or other issues like that, really clear, bold text on a background that isn't busy or confusing really lends itself to a better reading experience for all, in addition to providing necessary contrast so that individuals with low vision can decipher the text and get the information that you're trying to communicate. The next technical requirements that we want to talk about at kind of a high level are supplemented audio and video. So, of course, on our websites we need to caption our videos and provide transcripts for audio information. And there are varying levels of compliance included in the WCAG guidelines. So again, universal design principles apply here. Transcripts and captioning can benefit all. If you think of, for example, accessing a video on your phone, perhaps through social media while others are around and you have your sound off, you can view the video captioning and understand the content, what's going on, without disrupting the individuals around you. The issue of video and audio can be a daunting task. An example here is with UC Berkeley. The Department of Justice found the university to be in violation of the ADA with respect to its videos and audio files. And as a result, the administration moved to take down more than 20,000 publicly available videos because of the extreme expense of complying of what it would take to make all of those videos accessible. So this really can be a burdensome issue, but one that is definitely, you should definitely be taking stock of when looking at your websites. You want to look for assurances from vendors and also be aware of captioning resources that are available. YouTube provides captioning for videos if you use that as your means of uploading videos. There are also captioning resources that are available through some nonprofits.
It is really not just a fact, reading the content. It is also about the navigation. We have to discover the page, and then that is the most time-consuming problem. Because once you know where you are, what you are reading, then it is usually fine. But the discovery process or navigation process is the most complicated process in an accessibility field. In order to do it, I have to read from top to bottom. Whereas in the accessible version, I could easily see what the major components were, and then select the desired one and move to that section.
Okay, so as that video highlighted, navigation is a really critical issue when it comes to your website's compliance. It is an area that we know, OCR is very focused on, and really at its core, the navigation through your website is truly important because it's how one can operate the website and get all the information and the value from your website. So this is an operable principle, and it's individuals being able to interact with the information. So, for example, if an individual is not using a mouse, we need to make sure that an individual is able to access the various menus and submenus by using a keyboard. So this really relates to how your pages are structured and how you use headings and subheadings and lists to organize your website. So if you think for a moment, an individual without a visual impairment, within the first few seconds that they get to a website, they can really receive a lot of different information because pages are organized in such a way to communicate this information in different categories. So we organize it with menus. Information may be in bold. Information may be featured in a sidebar. So the idea is to mark up a page so that this organizational information is also communicated to individuals with visual or mobility impairments.
And Elizabeth, we got a good question as you kind of are finishing up this section. The question that came in is we're talking a lot about websites. What about learning management systems and information that is loaded or uploaded to learning management systems? Why don't you respond to that?
Yeah, so you're absolutely going to have a non-discrimination obligation to make sure that your learning management systems are accessible and that the information provided through it is accessible to your students. The legal analysis may be a little different because that's not public-facing, may not fall under Title III or issues of public accommodation, but certainly with respect to individual students, it may be an accommodation issue to make sure that the information is communicated to them in an accessible manner and they're able to access the class and the course material in an equally effective way. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Julie to talk about two of our last bits of technical issues.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. So one of our recommendations, and I know this sounds a little bit common sense, but we think it's an important one to highlight, is that as you're working to develop or restructure your own websites, we recommend that you really take some time to think about whether the information that you're communicating is really understandable functionally, and that the information that you're presenting is presented in a predictable way. One of the things that we see on a lot of websites, for instance, is text that may be highlighted and italicized in Latin, or there may be Spanish or other language options. One of the things that needs to happen behind the scenes is that language needs to be marked for its proper language. We want to see that the website really functions and is designed in a way that if you're interacting with a user, that the task can be carried out easily. And so we recommend that as you look at this for functionally providing an understandable website, that you are using that universal design methodology that Elizabeth mentioned earlier, which is that you're trying to build a website for everyone, a diverse set of users that may or may not have a disability, and that it's functional for everyone. A good example of this is that if you have a button on a website, whether you can see it or you can tab and access it through an accessible function, that button is used consistently throughout your website, so that if it reappears in different places, that it doesn't have different functionality. Again, I know this sounds like a bit of a common sense recommendation, but the understandability is really what you're going for, because this is a communications tool and you want to make sure that all of your users are getting the benefit of the information you're conveying in an easy fashion. Another area that we want to highlight that you pay special attention to are any of your accessible forms or files, or just forms or files that may not be accessible. Your goal would be to make these accessible so that users with screen readers or other assistive technology devices are able to fill them out and submit forms and files in an equal way alongside any individuals with not disabilities that don't have disabilities are able to do so. So many times we are using our websites to interact with your user. A very prominent highlight of this for academia is that donor button that I see on so many websites. If you want to submit a donation to our institution, click here, and then it collects information. And a lot of institutions, you're actually able to submit your donation right online through that button. That is an example of some sort of a form that may need to be filled out in order to submit that donation. And of course, your alumni and development office want to make sure those donations are coming in. So you want to make sure that that functionality or that form is accessible. Other places where you may be interacting with your user may be future students and applicants, individuals who are looking for information as consumers and potential students, or potential employees that may be looking to work at your institution. Of course, current students. And so we recommend that you focus on forms and also PDF files. We see a lot of PDF files being loaded up onto websites so that we can provide maybe a little bit of information or summary information on the website about what may be in that PDF. But if you want to read the entire report, for instance, we're going to post that big 100-page PDF. We really suggest that you really think about those PDFs and whether they are, are they really needed? And if so, are they being presented in a way that they're searchable, they're text-based, and they're not just a scanned image of text that is not accessible? There's a lot of form feature controls that you can use in order to ensure that your mechanisms for filling in your forms are properly accessible by using certain labeling controls and grouping controls. We also recommend that you always provide instructions for all of your forms so that somebody who is looking to fill it out understands exactly what kind of information you're going to be looking for. Other features that we think are really helpful for building accessibility with your forms are inputs that ensure that, features that ensure that inputs of data or information in your forms have been validated as correct. For instance, if you're looking for a social security number, there should be numbers. There should be specific numbers of numbers in those fields. And if for some reason a user enters alphabetical or symbols instead of numbers, that's something that will get triggered because the data hasn't been validated properly. There are also user notifications that can pop up when the data looks like it's not the right kind of data, and those are all features of an accessible form that really help build and support accessibility. One other place I wanted to mention to you is that, as a resource, is that the University of Washington, which is the institution that put out the video that Elizabeth has highlighted, actually has some very good instructions on its website for how do you make PDFs more accessible and more user-friendly. And so I just wanted to highlight that there's a good resource out there that's really available on that university's website, and we can send a link around after the webinar with that information as well. Another, Elizabeth, I'm going to turn to you to start our compliance points.
Okay, great. Thanks, Julie. So now we just want to highlight a few compliance points for you as you begin or continue to really sort of tackle this issue of assessing and addressing accessibility on your website. So first, as with most tasks, you want to begin with information gathering. So really at the beginning, you need to assess your web presence. So this is as basic as figuring out how many websites you have, in your edu domain, how many different sites do you have within that, and how many pages within those sites. So as you know, as you're operating through a website, each click takes you to page after page after page. So you may have, depending on the size of your institution, you may have 3,000 web pages. You may have close to 1 million web pages. So this really is an important place to start when thinking about your website accessibility. You also want to consider, again, those various websites and links that you may have to third-party websites, your activity on social media, how those are or are not accessed on your web page. You want to take stock of what information you're trying to convey and how you're doing that, and then also what functions are offered to the website. So an example there would be, the student-centered functions that you provide your students to the website, tuition payment or signing up for classes. All of these things are functions that you offer to your students, and therefore, are going to need to try to make sure that they are accessible to all. In addition to assessing your web presence, you also want to get information from and about your internal team and from your external partners. So, what does your web communications team look like? How many individuals are comprised of it? You want to, take stock of the resources that you have in-house to really tackle this issue. And again, depending on your size and your budget, you may come out, with different answers there. You may be really limited internally with respect to how you can have the time to address this issue. But where you can, you want to really tap into your internal web communications team to try to tackle some of these issues. You also want to think about how decentralized the operation of your website is. We're going to talk in a moment about establishing a policy so that we can really try to kind of control our content. But many of you have a website that operates at a very decentralized level. When it comes to web accessibility, higher education institutions are unfortunately in a difficult position with respect to how accessible their websites are. That's because they've been using websites for a number of years, and just by a function of operation, they really do have a decentralized functioning. So we had a question, for example, about an instructor who may be uploading a YouTube video or a PDF file to a College of Arts and Sciences web page. Whose responsibility is that? The answer is, you can put controls in place to try to manage that and monitor that, but the non-discrimination obligation goes back to the institution. So depending on how you, again, draft your policies or draft your controls, you can try to prevent the uploading of inaccessible content, but it really is on the institution. It's incumbent upon the institution more broadly to make sure that the content is accessible. So really looking at how decentralized the operation is can help you to address some of these issues. And the next compliance point is to establish a policy and internal procedure. So as we talked about earlier with our first poll question, many of you have already established a website accessibility policy. That's important because it identifies the standard that you're going to use to test your content, which Julie will talk about here in a minute. And it also sets up these internal controls. So oftentimes what we recommend is, being both forward-thinking in how we want to manage content that is yet to even go on our website, and then how we want to address legacy content. So the issues of PDFs that Julie talked about, which inaccessible PDFs really, plague many of our clients, and audio and video and that type of content. We want to have a plan to address some of those issues, but also want to be forward-looking in how we are going to address or how we are going to control and upload content to our website. And Julie, I'll turn it over to you to talk about our final compliance points.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. So as you're evaluating your existing web content or that legacy content that Elizabeth referred to, we have a couple of tips that we'd like to suggest. One is that we know a lot of institutions are relying on these free checker tools which are out there. You can run a check or a scan on your website and get a report with information as to what sort of errors you may be having or accessibility issues. And we want to suggest that you not only rely on those, but that you also include a number of manual checks. In our experience, those tools are a really great starting point to get a sense of the depth of and extent of your accessibility concerns. But we also see a lot of false positives and also a lot of missed areas where, and this is particularly on issues like color contrast, that is just simply difficult to check for. So when you include manual checks into your evaluation of your own web content, you actually get somebody looking at the site and looking for things like, is the contrast really separate enough or enough to make something much more visually available or accessible. We also recommend that institutions really consider a technology consultant as they're looking to evaluate their existing content. You may have a lot of internal talent and folks within your own IT team right now who have knowledge and experience within web accessibility, or you may not. But either way, sometimes it's hard to know what you don't know. And even folks who really are skilled in this area may not be seeing or aware of things that are occurring in the background or on other sites that a technology consultant can come in and help you identify. It's a strategy that we use. We work with a not-for-profit technology consultant that we hire in to support our work. That way there's a cloak of privilege so that whether our clients are doing preventative work to try to get their websites accessible because that's just their own initiative, or if they're responding to litigation or an OCR complaint, that we have that extra expert there to help build the knowledge and expertise within the IT team, but then to also, in a much more cost and time-effective way, identify the errors and really prioritize how do you bring your legacy content into compliance. So we really do recommend that consultant model, and we think it really can allow your tech team the partner that it may need to develop the skills it needs in order to ensure continued compliance. Another area is to look for template fixes and trends, because if you can fix a template, then you're fixing a problem that may be occurring across all of your web pages. It worried me, when Elizabeth said that many of you may have a million web pages. I mean, that's a lot to try to manually fix, but if you can fix those through templates, you're doing really well. Another compliance point is we would recommend that you prioritize your remedial efforts to focus on those high-traffic websites, the places where you know that you're getting a lot of hits. Also, just to avoid the irony of having an inaccessible page that's focused on disability services, we would very much recommend that you prioritize any websites that you have that discuss disability services. Focus on individual complaints. If you do get complaints, those are the kinds of things you want to address very expeditiously on those types of pages. And of course, address the low-hanging fruit. When you do a scan and you get a report back that says you've got a bunch of errors, your IT team is maybe looking at something feeling that this is a daunting task. If you start prioritizing the things that are easy to fix, you'll actually start making progress, and it's not as big of a job as you may think that it is. But you've got to prioritize, because it's unrealistic to think that you can tackle all of the problems at once, and it will give your web team and your web development team a sense of comfort that they can make progress in steps. Another point is we recommend that you use a train-the-trainer model. There's a lot of folks out there that may be touching your website, whether they are within your IT team as web developers or coders, or they're folks who are developing content. You really need to have a knowledgeable and skilled team across your institution. Anyone who's adding content to the web really needs to understand not only your new policies, but also your practices for identifying errors within legacy content. You're trying to build a knowledge base within your team because your systems controls and checks can only go so far, and so we think this is a method that really helps you build the capacity that you need in order to ensure that issues get remediated quickly and that you're avoiding the unforced error of creating problems for yourself with inaccessible new content. We also suggest that you identify a coordinator so that you have a reporting mechanism for complaints. Given the variability of websites, how dynamic they are, how often you're putting on new content, it's inevitable that you're going to run into issues where you may have an inaccessible page somewhere or a feature somewhere as a result of either new content going up that's not properly made accessible or legacy content that gets found later. You really need to have a centralized hub for somebody who's identified to handle these. So I know we're at time and we have a number of questions to respond to, so we will be sending out responses to all your questions to make sure that they're answered. Haley and Elizabeth, I'll turn it back to you in case there's anything we can answer quickly before we wrap up.
Thanks, Julie. We do have one question that we can answer quickly, and Julie, we'll start off with you. So the question that was submitted was, is lack of resources or lack of people available to do this work a sufficient response if you get an OCR complaint or for that matter, a litigation complaint? And what would your response be to that, Julie?
I have worked with institutions big and small on this issue, and I am surprised every single time, and I think they're surprised that as we start this work, it is not as hard and time-consuming as you think. I don't want to underestimate the effort that's involved to try to bring a website, especially one that's as extensive as 1 million pages, into compliance. But if you break it into digestible chunks, if you start with the low-hanging fruit, the things that are easy, there will be resources within your institution, folks who are just interested in this that you may be able to tap. And then also consultants are a really good, useful way. If you've got somebody who's in charge of designing your website who's a third party, they should be doing this. And then protect yourself by building in assurances within your procurement process to ensure that any new technologies and web development or web content that's being developed for the institution are compliant and that that's built into your contract.
Great. Well, that is all the time we have for questions. We want to thank everyone for joining our program today. We hope the information has been helpful to you and your institution. If you have not done so already, please click on the survey icon at the bottom of your screen and complete a short survey. Your feedback is very helpful to us to ensure quality programs and also as we're planning for our content for 2018. Our preparations have begun and we really like your feedback of what you want to hear in 2018. As a reminder, this program has been approved for continuing legal education credit in Colorado, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Tennessee, Texas, and Wisconsin. A recording of this webinar will be available to you tomorrow for your watching and sharing. Once available, you'll receive a link. Also, that link will contain a certificate of attendance. The recording is available for 2 weeks. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, if you'd like access to the slides, they are in your resource folder. So just go ahead and click on that. And also, please be sure to join us next week on December 5th. We are having our final 2017 webinar on 403B operational compliance assessment and issues with 403B plans. This concludes our webinar. I'd like to thank Julie and Elizabeth for the extremely helpful information. Have a good afternoon.